Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. You know, we hear a lot about the greatest generation. That's, of course, in reference to those Americans who fought in World War II, won the war to end all wars, and then came home and built the U.S. into an economic powerhouse. Well, maybe it's because there are no more World War I veterans alive, but we don't hear quite as much about them. Well, today we will. Our guest today is Eric Stevens of the Stevens Company in Thomaston. He works in that family business, the family business that his grandfather started after he fought in World War I and received an incredibly important assignment involving the top American military leader in Europe, General John Pershing. Eric's going to be along in just a moment to explain just how significant his grandfather's accomplishments were during and after the war. Just wait until you hear that story. This week's trivia question: this was a top-secret military mission out of Groton in 1969 that went horribly wrong. What was it? We'll stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic we'll have on next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. There are some remarkable people in the world, and we all know some. They might be in your own family or maybe somebody you know. And today, we're going to feature one of those people, somebody, not a household name, but who accomplished an incredible amount in his lifetime. And he's also one of those persons that occasionally you hear about. Didn't get past the 8th grade in terms of a formal education, but he was so smart, he was so resourceful that he not only succeeded in his own life, but he achieved extraordinary results, including an especially important task during World War I. Carlton Stevens is the man, and he was born in Ridgefield, and his list of accomplishments includes the following. He started the first ham radio operation in Ridgefield, Connecticut. He wasn't even 10 years old at the time, and radio was brand new, a novel technology, and he figured it out at 10. During World War I, he got accepted into the prestigious 10-man motorcycle squad that served as the courier service for top-secret documents for none other than General John Pershing. Pershing was the head of U.S. forces in Europe during World War I. And wait until you hear about some of the harrowing missions that he had to undertake. After the war, he started a business that is thriving to this day. He got a patent on a machine that was core to that business, and he produced a particular part that was used in the Manhattan Project during the development of the first atomic bomb. Now, all this without a formal education beyond the 8th grade. The Stevens Company that he founded is still in business in Thomaston, Connecticut. Many family members work there, including Carlton Stevens' grandson, Eric Stevens. And Eric is our guest today on Amazing Tales CT. Eric, it is a pleasure to chat with you today because your grandfather, when people hear the story of what your grandfather did, to me, it's just remarkable. And I think that, the audience is going to feel the same way. And let's face it, your grandfather was born right around the turn of not this century, but the last century. So he was born in, I think it was like 1898. And, one of these guys who didn't finish high school, but yet was so accomplished in every single thing he did. And so let's start off, with this. He was born in Ridgefield. He grew up and he had this ham radio station. What can you tell me about this? He started this at a very young age, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. He had an interest in it. I think there might have been some older guys somewhere in the area, but it was said that he was the first one in Ridgefield. He had an interest in ham through his whole life. Back in those days, he had to learn Morse code. So he knew Morse code, and when he was older, he would talk to friends around the world, actually, and my father would talk to him on the ham when he was out sailing. So it was pretty interesting.
So he grows up in Ridgefield. He's going to end up moving out of Ridgefield after the war and going to the Waterbury area. But now let's talk about World War One. He enlists at the ripe old age of 20, and he gets put into the most incredible group. So General Pershing, who's in charge of what they called the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, he's leading all the U.S. troops in Europe. And your grandfather, Carlton, is assigned to the 10-member motorcycle corps that serviced General Pershing during this war. And not only was he in this exclusive group, but the other 9, as I understand it, were professional drivers. Your dad was, or your grandfather was the only so-called amateur. Was that correct?
Correct.
That's amazing. What kind of stories did you hear about him, in terms of this being a very dangerous occupation?
Well, I heard, of course, they couldn't carry rifles. They were given 45 autos, Colt automatics. They did get shot at times, and the roads back then in France were rough, dirt roads, and sometimes they're traveling, 40, 45 miles an hour, which doesn't seem like much to us today, but back then on a motorcycle, the motorcycles weren't what they are now, and the roads weren't what they are now. It could be pretty dangerous, and there was some mention in his letters of a few crashes, and he wrote his brother and said, "No, don't tell Mom, just tell him that I'm fine." Trying to dodge shell fire occasionally, but also rough roads.
Did you hear a particular story about him coming under shell fire one time that was so intense that he had to hide for 5 days in a swamp or something?
Yeah, I don't know if it was 5 days or 3 days. Definitely more than a few. And they said that he just had chocolate and bacon or something like that, and rainwater from his helmet.
Wow. Wow. Now, when he was working for General Pershing, this is really, I think, one of the keys to the story, is that as we're nearing the end, finally, of World War I, and the armistice is being proposed to end the war, the treaty to end the war, your grandfather was given the task of riding over 800 miles with that treaty to get to General Pershing, correct?
Correct.
Tell us what you know about that ride.
I only know that it was long, and he couldn't stop because he had to get it to him as soon as possible.
I heard that it took him 19 hours, which is remarkable because that means he was averaging 48 miles an hour. This is what I heard. Your grandfather and your father both passed away while you were young, so you hear these stories from other members of your family?
Yeah, well, my father, I was about 21 when my father passed away. Told me some, but he wasn't really up on all the history of the family. And my grandfather, I have one recollection of him, and I must have been 2 years old, holding me. Some stories were passed on by other family members, and some things I read. I went back to Ridgefield and trying to find as much information as I could about that side of the family.
According to the letters that came back to your family from your grandfather, of that 10-member unit, what happened to the other 9 riders?
Killed in action.
So your grandfather was the only one who survived?
Yeah, of the original ones. They had replacements who came later on, but that happened. The war was winding down by that time. And he ended up becoming corporal, I think, and he had over 100 machines under his charge at that time, being the senior member left. He had other riders under his command. He ended up staying in France until summer of 1919.
Now, after the war, as incredible as that story is and what your grandfather did there, he's already had enough experiences for most people to fill a lifetime, yet he's just in his early 20s. And what does he do? He moves over to the Waterbury area and opens a company. Tell us about that company.
He came to Waterbury, moved from Ridgefield to Waterbury for work, and then by the late 30s, he decided to start his own business, ended up building 2 machines and running them from his garage starting his own business, started making parts, some for the government, some for other industries, and he was still working at American Brass. He ended up going to work at his current job during the day and then teaching my grandmother to run the machines while he was at work, and then he'd come home and count the parts and, keep it running through the night until he went to bed. And that's where the shop, Stevens Company, came out of it.
So just so the audience understands, what kind of parts was he making? What were they made out of? What were they used for?
Eyelets and stampings, which are small parts. Actually, they're micro parts made from thin strips of metal that's in coils, and they're used in various industries, in electronics and jewelry sometimes, and automotive parts.
Did he actually earn a patent for one of those machines?
Yeah. Actually, one of his machines is down on display in the Mattock Museum in downtown Waterbury. Kids can go in there and push a button to see it run.
Now, most people saw the Oscar winner Oppenheimer about the Manhattan Project. My understanding is that your grandfather, at least in some way, contributed parts to that project.
Yes, I believe with the Oak Ridge division, I have a few papers from back then, but the few papers that are remaining just basically said that he was making radioactive metals. And I know he made some parts for radar and helped develop a radar tube. At the time, he didn't need to anymore, and he has to be relieved of that commission.
So during the Manhattan Project, it's my understanding that your grandfather also got a very prestigious request to come and give a lecture. Can you tell us about that?
Yale invited him to lecture on the tube he developed for part of the Manhattan Project. I think that's just amazing to think of somebody who never even finished high school, end up lecturing at Yale. Just goes to show you, if you have the determination, even coming from a simple upbringing, you work hard, there's some amazing things you can accomplish.
Now, one of the stories about your grandfather that I think just has to be told is when he opened his business, and this is something you just don't hear anything like this today in terms of manager-employee relations, was that he had at one point, I guess, about 20 workers, and as a reward for their hard work, which I guess he was a fairly demanding guy, but if you worked hard and gave him your all, he would reward you with a vacation. Tell us about that.
He began to love Puerto Rico, actually, and when he was older and got into his late 50s and 60s, and he bought a couple condos in a high-rise in San Juan. When he was older, he liked to go down there in the winters and kind of run the business from there. And actually, he would talk to my father via ham radio to get his daily updates on production. So he was known to bring employees and friends down, to stay at his extra apartment down there. If they were good at production and were working hard, he'd give them a break down there.
That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Eric Stevens has worked over the years with Ridgefield historian Jack Sanders to track down more information on his grandfather, and it's where a lot of the information in today's story came from. The Stevens Company in Thomaston continues to make the same types of parts that Carlton Stevens kicked off 100 years ago after that successful service in World War I. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Eric Stevens of that Stevens Company in Thomaston, grandson of the legendary motorcycle courier during World War I, Carlton Stevens. Well, the answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, this was a top-secret military mission out of Groton, Connecticut in 1969 that went horribly wrong. What was it? Well, the answer is it was a rendezvous between the ship Sea Surveyor and a nuclear submarine 275 miles south of Nantucket Island to do some radio tests. Well, that never happened because the military ship sank in the Atlantic Ocean during gale force winds and 25-foot waves with 12 crew members on board. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we bring you a survivor of this harrowing story, the first in a two-part series that will leave you mesmerized. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.